Chapter 1. The Story of Colony of the United States. How a New World is Formed.
Once upon a time, across a vast ocean, a new land waited to be explored. Not new to the people who already lived there, of course, but new to the European powers eager for land, trade, and influence. That land was North America. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, European explorers began sailing west. Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England all took part in the race. But our story, America's story, really picks up in the early 1600s, when England began establishing settlements along the Atlantic coast. The first long-term English settlement? Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. It wasn't a paradise. In fact, life there was extremely difficult. Illness, food shortages, and tensions with native communities made survival uncertain. But Jamestown endured, just barely, and thanks to the growth of tobacco, the settlement started to succeed. Not long after, another group of settlers arrived farther north, people searching not just for opportunity, but for freedom to worship as they chose. These were the Pilgrims, and they landed in 1620 at a place they named Plymouth, in what's now Massachusetts. Their story, of course, gave us Thanksgiving, though the reality was much more challenging than the holiday we celebrate today. These early colonies were just the beginning. Over the next century and a half, more settlers made the journey across the Atlantic. By the early 1700s, there were 13 British colonies stretching from New Hampshire down to Georgia. Each one had its own culture, economy, and way of life. In the north, places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut became known for trade, shipbuilding, and education. People lived in close-knit communities where shared values and local traditions were central. Schools and meeting houses often served as the heart of daily life. In the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, there was great diversity. People of different backgrounds, beliefs, and languages lived and worked side by side. These colonies were known for fertile farmland and became the breadbasket for the amount of grain they produced. And in the South, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, farming was dominant. Large estates grew tobacco, rice, and indigo, relying on the labor of people brought from Africa. The economy became shaped by this system. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and much of life was centered around rural areas. But life wasn't easy in any of the colonies. People faced harsh winters, limited medical knowledge, and ongoing challenges. Still, the population grew from just a few thousand settlers in the early 1600s to more than 2 million by the mid-700s. And what about the native peoples? They had been living on this land for thousands of years. The arrival of Europeans brought major changes, new diseases, shifting territories, and cultural clashes. Some tribes worked with the settlers, others opposed their expansion. But overall, it was a time of deep disruption and loss. By the mid-18th century, the colonies had grown into something unique. They had their own governments, their own publications, and even their own way of speaking. Many still saw themselves as loyal to Britain, but something was changing. They were beginning to feel like they belonged to a new identity. They were beginning to feel American. Then came the French and Indian War, from 1754 to 1763. It was part of a much larger struggle between Britain and France. The colonies supported British troops, and in the end, they won. Britain gained a large amount of land in North America, but the cost was high, and Britain expected the colonies to help pay for it. New taxes were introduced, new rules were set, and to many colonists, it felt like their freedoms were being limited by a ruler across the sea. And just like that, the early signs of revolution began to appear. The colonial era didn't end in a sudden moment, but rather through a long and steady shift. By 1776, the colonies were no longer just extensions of an empire. They had become the birthplace of a powerful idea that people could shape their own government. and that idea was about to change the world.
Chapter 2. The Birth of a Nation, the Revolutionary Journey of the U.S. from 1776 to 1789.
In the summer of 1776, a group of determined men gathered in Philadelphia. They weren't soldiers or kings. They were farmers, lawyers, merchants, representatives from 13 British colonies, and they had come together to do something bold, even dangerous. They were going to declare independence from the most powerful empire on earth. On July 4th, the Second Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, written mostly by Thomas Jefferson. The document wasn't just a list of complaints against King George III. It was a statement of principles. It said that all people are created equal, that they have rights no government can take away, and that when a government becomes destructive of those rights, the people have the right to change it. But Britain wasn't going to let its colonies go without a fight. The Revolutionary War had already begun the year before with skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Now, it would become a full-blown war for independence. George Washington, a Virginia planter and former British officer, had been named commander of the Continental Army. He faced a nearly impossible task, leading an army of volunteers, short on supplies and training, against one of the best professional armies in the world. The war raged across the colonies. Sometimes it seemed the American cause was hopeless, but over time, the tide began to turn. In 1777, the American victory at Saratoga convinced France to join the war on the side of the revolutionaries. French ships, soldiers, and money gave the cause new life. In 1781, with the help of the French Navy and troops, Washington surrounded the British at Yorktown, Virginia. The British general, Lord Cornwallis, surrendered. The war wasn't officially over until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, but Yorktown marked the beginning of the end. The United States had won its independence. But now came the harder part, figuring out how to govern a new nation. At first, the country was held together by the Articles of Confederation, a loose agreement between the states. The federal government had little power. It couldn't collect taxes or regulate trade. States printed their own money. There was no president, and Congress had no real authority. What had worked during wartime quickly began to fall apart in peace. By the mid-1780s, many leaders realized the government needed to be stronger. In 1787, delegates from 12 states met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. But instead of fixing them, they wrote something entirely new: the United States Constitution. The Constitution created a federal government with 3 branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. It gave Congress the power to make laws, the president the power to enforce them, and the courts the power to interpret them. It also included checks and balances, so no one branch could dominate the others. But not everyone trusted this new system. Some feared it gave the central government too much power. To win over skeptics, the founders promised a Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that would guarantee individual freedoms like speech, religion, and the right to a fair trial. In 1788, after months of debate, the Constitution was ratified by the states. The next year, in 1789, George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States. It had taken 13 years, from the first shots fired in 1775 to the establishment of a functioning government in 1789. But the journey had created something new in the world, a republic built not on bloodlines or royal decree, but on ideas, liberty, democracy, and the belief that government exists to serve the people. The American Revolution didn't just create a country. It created a model, an inspiration, and a promise that continues to shape the world today.
Please subscribe to the channel to continue.